about the budget or what we're doing, it's your prerogative, you know, if you're going to do the public forum beforehand. However, you may have comments about what we're suggesting that you would want the board to consider. So that's, I just wanted to share that. And Jeff, you wanted to say something about the website and how they can access it?
Madam President, members of the board, if you go to www.sfps.info on your phone, it's right on the front here with the agenda. If you click on it, it's mobile friendly. You should be able to pull it up.
All in favor of approval of the agenda?
Aye.
Aye.
Linda, do we have you? Aye. I'll put the speaker on. That second speaker, put it on the phone.
It's there. This is on.
Okay. We are also joined by board member Linda Trujillo by telephone. Okay.
Hi, everybody.
Are there any board announcements? No board announcements. Superintendent announcements.
Introduction of the interpreter.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Good evening, Superintendent, board members, audience. My name is Alma Bejar, and I will be doing the translation services in Spanish. Buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Alma Bejar y voy a hacer las traducciones en español. Si necesitan mi asistencia, voy a estar hacia atrás. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Superintendent announcements.
Hi there. I'll keep him.
He snuck up on you.
No announcements for me, Madam President.
Okay. Well, then let's go on to the presentation for the finance sub.
Public forum.
I'm sorry, public forum. I'm having a hard time tonight. Really hard time.
So, I know there was a sign-up sheet for public forum. Where do we have it? All right, so do you want to read the rules for public forum first?
Sure. The public forum ground rules are as follows. Please listen and speak with respect. No uncivil conduct will be permitted. Do not discuss any specific student who is not your own. No sharing of time. Self-monitor and observe the 3-minute time limit. I will give you a 30-second warning when your time is almost up. Public commentary and dialogue is allowed only during the public forum, not throughout the meeting. Please search for answers on common ground. You may speak on any topic, whether it is on the agenda or not. Your input will be taken into consideration. Please be advised that the board may discuss your issue during the meeting, but by law, the board cannot take action on items that are not on the agenda.
Thank you. Would you call the names three at a time? And I'm going to ask once again that if you're going to speak at the public forum now, that it not be about the possible closing of the schools.
President Price, we have 4 individuals who signed up for public forum.
Okay, thank you. Would you call
Sure.
their names, please?
The first one is Filomena Salem. And if, right after Filomena, if you could please stand here behind the podium, would be Marta Lonson and Deborah Garcia. Sorry, Filomena, I apologize. I believe you have a presentation, so you will come up first after the presentation, Finance Subcommittee. But so our first speaker at this time is Marta Lonson. Townsend? Okay.
Is there any, why don't we just see who wants to speak at public forum and just introduce yourself, and then we just get the names? Was there anyone that wanted to speak before the presentation?
So Deborah Garcia?
The first public forum.
You're asking if someone wants to speak not on the closure.
Right.
To speak now. So who wants to speak not about the closure?
Well, you could speak about the budget. You could still wait till after because we're doing the entire budget. Then I think we can move on.
Okay.
Just
Look-
make sure you sign up on the sheet for public forum if you're going to speak later. Thank you.
So Deborah Garcia, are you up? Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hello? Is it on?
Just push the button.
Okay. Hello, my name is Deborah Garcia. I have a son, a grandson who attends school at ECO, and he's 16 years old. And I'm just here to talk a little bit about ECO and the benefit that it has on Josiah. Josiah has been very involved in a lot of projects at the school, which he's very proud of and I'm very proud of. He made this wonderful doghouse that we use at home all the time on a daily basis for the dogs. He's built this incredible aquaponics project, and I couldn't even explain it to you. You'd have to see it, but it's just really impressive, the things that he's learned at the ECO. And he's scheduled to attend a class at the Santa Fe Community College this summer for medical terminology. So he's working towards the dual credit program at the community college, and he'll be getting credits at the school as well as the college. And I just want to say that I really like the idea of ECO because Josiah has, I see a calmness in him from school. He went to Santa Fe High the first year, and he would get a little stressed out, and now I see a lot of calmness in him. I see his excitement, his participation in school, and I'm really excited for him. And we're going to move forward with he wants to go to school for athletic training. And so I just want to say that I think that ECO is a really good opportunity for him. I think that it was a really good idea to put ECO together. And I really like that he has communication with all of his teachers, the principal, and I think all the students. They have a lot of interaction with the teachers, and I think that ECO has just really been a great opportunity for all the kids that started at ECO this year, and it's been their first year. And I really believe that the coming years are going to be even better. I think this first year was a little bit tough, but I think that from this point on, it's just going to be a great school for kids to attend. And that's what I wanted to say today, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you.
Okay, next on the list, we have Donna DeMarco. Okay.
Is there anyone else for public forum, or we're going to move on? All right, we'll move on. The presentation for the Finance Subcommittee.
Thank you, Madam President, members of the board. Presenters tonight, including myself, will be Carl Grenler, our Chief Financial Officer and Governmental Relations Officer, Christy Wagner-Yanda, our Chief Operations Officer. There will be staff from ARC that will also be presenting, and Christy will introduce them, Dr. James Lujan. And then we do have some select principals who have not had an opportunity, part of their presentation, to talk a little bit about the fair student funding cuts. Could go to the next slide. The budget topics discussions tonight basically will be a historical overview, the current financial situation, possible cost savings, and then questions and answers. Obviously, we'll have the public forum as well. So you've seen this before, and where we've been and trying to decide how we present this in a time of chaos, and it really has been a chaotic time. And there's several things that I want to share, and I feel kind of funny because I would like to be able to address you and not have my back to you, but this is the way we're set up. So hopefully you won't feel that I'm not wanting to make eye contact with everybody in this room. But historically, where we look where we've been, and I've been in this business, I don't even want to tell you how many years, but I've never seen anything quite like this where you actually take these kinds of cuts. We've had changes in the SEG, but never that I can remember the type of cuts that we've taken this year and the uncertainty. During the special session, we had a cut in this current fiscal year of $2.1 million. We had the cash sweep. That cash sweep of $1.9 million remains. When you see the budget scenarios, we do not replace that cash. It's created a moving target. When we started this process, when Carl started working with the staff and the team with the schools on the Fair Student Funding Formula, the planning actually started in January. They started meeting with schools in February. At that time, in January, we heard from the LFC that the cut could to plan for as much as 5%. That's where that $9 million figure came from. Additionally, we've begun to see a war on education at the federal level in terms of the cuts, and we're starting to see those trickle in. We did not know what we could see. Our district relies heavily on federal funds. We became very alarmed as the session was ending, that it appeared that we would see more cuts to public education. And we had a rally. Do you remember the rally that we had? That rally was to keep us from being in this scenario. And I do want to address some of the letters that I've received that said EJ stood by me. Well, it wasn't me. It was the district on the rally. And they said, now stand by us. Well, I think the real issue is the rally was to protect all of us from being in this situation. And where the rallies need to continue to be and whatever kind of concern needs to be with the policymakers at the Roundhouse, because that's where the money come from. We are having to deal with the revenue that we have. We believe that we have, this changes constantly. As late as, and you'll hear in the presentation, April 12th, 2 weeks ago about, we found out that the public ed department had another $40 million that they were going to give us. That improved the scenario for us. Had we not gotten that $40 million, it would have been $1.5 million cut for us. We just found out about that 2 weeks ago. So we've had to plan for the most draconian kind of situation to one that, depending on what level of risk this board wants to take, is not as bad as we thought. We are trying to be flexible, and I think that we've said it many times in this presentation. I know Carl has said it. It's a fluid process, and we're trying to provide the best information we can with the cuts that we have. Tonight, we will be presenting options to the board, most of them on the survey, some that were not on the survey. But one thing I think we all can agree on in this room and those that are listening, and I think across the state of New Mexico, there is no good cut that you can make in education. We have continued to see cuts for many years now, and these, education cuts, they say don't heal. That is the truth. Education cuts don't heal. There are no good choices here. But in the choices that were presented, we've had, this is our third, I think, study session. We have shared, and it's been up there on the screen, $3.1 million on fair student funding. No one has really paid attention to that in terms of being an outcry, and tonight we're going to go into it with a little bit more in depth as an option. But when they say stories get legs, the story that has gotten legs are the school closures. And people have made the conclusion, oh, you've made the decision, that's what you're doing, you're not considering any option. We've said that's not true, but I think it's human nature, to not believe administration. I don't know why, but that's just the way it is. So tonight you're going to hear all the options, and I can tell you that 3.1, and you can talk to the schools, they have been dealing with these cuts and knowing that this was happening. If you're on a SAC at your school, you know what your schools might be having to be cut depending on the option that the board takes. I do want to say one thing just in general. Small schools would be great. We understand that. The problem is that as a state, we have not been funded to have that in the way that we would. I don't think we would build the size of schools that we have if we had the option to do otherwise. So you'll see refinement in the numbers, particularly on the savings on school closure. And the reason for that is this has been a study. We are now presenting the study to the board today and doing what they asked us to do. And I want to commend the staff, particularly Carl and Christy, our Mr. Grenler and Ms. Wagner-Yanda. in terms of, they have actually followed each kid to see, and you'll be seeing proposed boundaries if the board should choose that option. And they're not choosing today, but let's just say school closure is an option that's selected, so that you would know what the proposed boundary would be. You would see where the kids would go, and we've been able to look at, would you need new teachers? Would you be able to put them in another classroom? No classes are overloaded. We stay, and you'll see the ratios if that was an option that was selected. Lastly, I want to say that a lot has changed for us as a staff between Friday and even today, based on what we've heard legislators say, both Republican and Democrat, about their desire to not further cut education. That has changed our comfort level with some of the numbers. And so between now, and we understand the Supreme Court is meeting on the 15th. I don't know if we'll be called to if the legislature will be called to a special session before then. But even between now and when the budget is due are eons of time, quite frankly, and a lot changes. So don't be surprised if you don't hear scenarios changing, because everything that we do is predicated on the funding that we receive. And to me, it's like a minute and a half left in an NBA game. A lot can happen in a minute and a half. Basketball time, that's a lot of time. Well, these next 3 weeks, as we go through this process, a lot can change. I'm hoping for the better, not for the worse. But again, I want to say, no decisions have been made. Tonight is the first time the board actually sees this all laid out with the data that we have from our study. And I do want to say that we did our best to listen with our head and our heart. And with that, I'll go on to the rest of the presentation. I don't want to read this. We've shared it many times, but basically the budget, the board priorities are, supporting our cash reserves, optimizing employee compensation and take-home pay, and the core program. And the board has supported programs like athletics and music, JROTC, extracurricular activities. Let's go to the next slide. So, Carl, you want to talk about the current financial situation and the level of risk? And we're probably going to need David, probably have you move over. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Superintendent. President Price, members of the board, colleagues, and audience. Before I get started on this very, very critical slide, I'd like to thank, before I forget it, Richard Halford, the Executive Director of Finance and Administration, who's my key financial sounding board in putting together a lot of these thoughts and these numbers. So thank you, Richard. So this slide, if you understand this slide, you're a long way toward understanding the challenge. So let's just spend a few minutes with it. You've seen parts of this in the past, but it's updated with new information. So if we look at column 1, if you can see that, that is where we started this year, the 16-17 year with a balanced budget. And the unit value that is represented there is the unit value we started with, and we balanced the budget based on that. Then as things changed, as the unit value changed during the special session to what is in column 2, that's the new baseline that we're operating on this year. And those reductions in revenue we took from cash this year as well as the cash sweep, and we'll address that in another slide here in just a few minutes. But that's where we are now. Column 3 represents the unit value that we just received, as the superintendent said, about a week and a half ago, what we call spring budget workshop, where this is announced. And we were surprised that it was higher. And we'll talk to a couple of those items in that unit value here on slides that'll follow. But the unit value and the resulting state equalization guarantee, most aren't aware, but the unit value is just the unit value per program unit, and program units are determined by a very complex formula in this state equalization guarantee, which has a whole raft of factors. And of course, our factors get represented in there, and in this amount, the net result was we lost a little bit of money from column 1 in the actual state equalization guarantee, which you can see, $63,000 less. And again, it's a combination of a lot of factors. And so when you take a look at the types of things that we have to increase this year, those are listed in the column. So we start with a negative 63,000 and a delta from this year, and we have an early termination of the Tierra Encantada High School lease. That's about $200,000 a year. A slight increase in utilities, minor for our district because of all the work we've done in conservation practices, probably higher in other districts. The health insurance premiums, about $250,000. Again, we thought this was going to be higher at the beginning of the year. We're grateful it's not higher. This represents an average of about 3.9% of an increase. Then the health insurance premiums for districts, we've for the employee portion, we've covered our employees because we're so cognizant of the fact that without any salary increases to reduce an employee's take-home pay is not our choice. The risk insurance premium, actually, that went down slightly this year, about $50,000, which we were grateful to see. It's the first year it's gone down in many, many years. Teacher Accelerated Licensure Program, which is an estimate, but this is basically a partially to non-funded program, from the Public Education Department, which allows our teachers to be advanced based on their evaluations rather than a dossier. This part is really huge. The transportation subsidy required from action in the special session. This is one of those things which just has kind of been forgotten. There was a pretty significant reduction in transportation during the special session as part of solvency, and it hasn't been restored. So that, plus the fact that we have a smaller ridership moving forward into next year, indicates that approximately $680,000 for transportation to and from will have to be subsidized from the operational budget. And then likewise, instructional materials was reduced in the special session, which we would subsidize from the operational budget as well. So that's how you get from the SEG to the 1.78.
Just want to clarify, some people, when they read that subsidy, they think we're getting subsidized. That means we're subsidizing it. Okay, so it winds up being a cut to the operational budget.
Thank you. Now in columns 4 and 5, and actually column 3 was light green. It doesn't look like that up there, but that's the actual allocation on the budget unit value from the Public Education Department. The yellow basically reflects a concern and a concern of risk. And so columns 4 and 5 reflect a reduction of 1% or 2% from our unit value today if in fact there is not a resolution on the remainder of the budget that needs to be balanced. And we've got a couple...
From the state.
Yes, thank you, from the state. And so there's a changing level of risk in these scenarios about what could happen to us. Now, the interesting thing is that you see in the bottom there in the middle, the operational cash balance was depleted via the legislative cash sweep to historically low levels. We don't have cash to rely on. So there's a risk in making a choice which has a high likelihood of being reversed or that revenue reduced because we don't have anywhere to go other than reducing our employees' compensation. And I think as we move through the presentation, as the superintendent said, we'll show these options and we'll be able to understand them better and how they fit together in our selection of how we approach the strategy of this year's budget.
So before we move on, because the slide is so important and you're going to see it again later, one of the things that the board has to decide, and I'm saying this more for the public so you get an idea of what's going on, is how comfortable are you with risk? And how, because none of us have a crystal ball. Now, maybe more information will be provided for us. That's why I was saying it's like a, minute and a half in a basketball game. A lot could change, and maybe we'll know what's going to happen. But right now, what we do know is that we have, no matter what happens, at present time, $1.78 million that we have to find somewhere to balance the budget. Some school districts are looking at the 2%, and a lot of them have been in the news, and they're planning on the worst-case scenario, and for us, that's $5.51 million. And as I said earlier, had it been 5%, as we were being told, it would have been close to $9 million for us. I just want to explain that range. The 1% is 4.54. There is nothing that prohibits the board to say, well, I'd be comfortable with the current unit value and you budget for 0.5% cut. Then we would calculate what that would be. or 1/4% cut, right? There's a million options. This just broke it out into big chunks, but a lot of how we build budget and a lot of what we cut will be determined on your comfort level of what you think we need to cut to balance. Okay, go ahead.
Right, just one more comment. Thank you, Superintendent. Just one more comment. The actual revenue that will be in our budget package to the Public Education Department is the reflection in column 3. That's what we have been issued from the state. So the other assessments of risk and potential revenue actually are useful then in driving how much we need to reduce in our expenditures from our balanced current year budget. Some of this we've discussed, and we'll just touch on it, but is the current budget value, or unit value that we received a week and a half ago at Spring Budget Workshop from the Public Education Department, is that solid or fluid? So it reflected an increase from HB2, which was approved by the legislature and approved by the governor with significant line item vetoes. And as the superintendent mentioned, we were pleasantly surprised to see that there were additional funds, that would increase the unit value in the SEG potentially. And as we all have been reading and heard, there's lawsuits being brought by the legislature in the courts, in the New Mexico Supreme Court, in reference to HB2. So the outcome of that, what it'll actually mean for our budgeting process is unknown at this point. Continuing on, as the superintendent said, many of our colleagues around the state are planning on a 2% cut because they're just not confident in what's been taking place and just can't believe that everything's fine now and that there's all the issues between the governor and the legislature have been resolved. Plus, everything is fine now in our state budget crisis. So to protect districts from insolvency, districts are making different decisions about how they should budget expenditures in the budget.
Go ahead.
All right.
So this slide's basically just about the cash balance, if we could go over it just very quickly.
You bet. This might look complicated, but it's really not. We'd approved $6.6 billion this year and started the year at $5.6 million. We had the SEG reduction of $1.5 million, a transportation reduction, which we were able to manage down to about $200,000, the cash sweep of $1.9 million, the second Connie installment payment for the sale of that facility to United Way of $1 million, and then we received an increase in Medicaid, which we're applying to the cash balance. So that's how we get to the 3.4, which is still historically low and well below the 5 to 7.5% operational range that the board has approved in policy, and obviously we're suspending that policy due to this emergency.
So what we're asking you to do, and again, so the audience understands, I know the board knows this, but just so the audience understands, is balancing risk in an unresolved state budget climate with the impact being cuts of your decisions on students, staff, and community. Go ahead.
So we're now in the lengthy section of discussing possible cost savings options. And the first one involves school budgets. And we're providing a bit of discussion points here, which I'll go through, which hopefully will be helpful in understanding how we budget schools. In the meeting we had at NAVA, one of the NAVA parents, Mr. Jim Reister, who's here today, asked a question about this and actually was very curious about how school budgets were formed. We spent some time together, and he suggested that it would be helpful to go over this. So let's go through this, and hopefully it will be just that. So the concept and development of school budgets is a little different in Santa Fe than it is in most districts in the state. The dollars follow the student and student needs. That's actually different. And we do that through a strategy and process that increases equity, transparency, and flexibility. So we budget the schools with the resources that they can manage directly to impact student performance from multiple funds. So weights are given to certain students at different grades and different economic and language conditions. Those all roll up into providing more resources for those schools that have higher poverty and higher English language learners. So the district staff budgets the related resources for the schools, which are maintenance and technology, student nutrition, transportation, security. So all of the services that surround the schools are budgeted and managed in support of that school and school principal. So in this process, because we have schools of various sizes, each school receives the funding for a principal and a secretary. Then plus a pool which is driven by the weights and program units which are student-related, are provided to each school, and they go shopping. So they buy resources at the average cost of teachers and all the different job classes, and that's how they build their budgets. So, and also the special education department manages the IEP-related services in working with the principals in the schools, and that's another $19 to $20 million. So it's a very complex process, and I think as we can see from this slide, it takes some time, and it takes a real commitment from the district to be able to support it. So we had meetings with the schools and their school advisory councils to be able to develop their budgets. Then we had 28 meetings. It took us an entire week to do this with the folks that are up there, led by Dr. James Lujan and all of the supporting staff of the district to be able to add value to the school and make sure that resources were budgeted that were necessary. Plus the chief academic officer and myself and representatives from business services and human resources. So the goal of all of this was to budget to core instructional and support services so that the schools could operate with fully functional and being able to support their core mission, but without any fluff in the budget. And the schools were budgeted based on what they needed, not just on their allocation. So about 2/3 of our schools, actually when they went shopping, finished up in the red because they needed extra resources to be able to reach that level of core instructional and support services. And we supported that.
This next slide, I think, is really important, and it makes me proud to be superintendent in the school district. And that is our PTR. If you look at the PTR levels of where we're at, is, I would say, significantly lower than probably, I'm sorry, the public pupil teacher ratio, thank you, is much lower. Go ahead, Carl.
So again, this is just a summary of what we did. We budgeted to core student and school need. And that ended up being with a net investment or a potential savings to the 2017-18 operational budget of $3.1 million.
Now, again, I don't think that this is, might we want to allocate resources differently? I think that if we're able to restore some of this, depending on the choices you make, we will bring the teams back together and really talk about how those resources will be used. Are they being used in the most efficient way that supports student achievement and programs that our kids need, services that they need? Go ahead, Carl.
Okay. So what that $3.1 million reflects is significant reductions in personnel. That's the only way you can reach savings in the operational budget when there's close to 87% of the entire budget in people. So here's just a list by job class of the reductions that we tallied up as we went through the school budget process. So you can see the largest by far is teachers, 1 through 12 teachers, 56, and then there's increases and decreases around the budget. But if you look towards the right side, you'll see that on the services side, we protected as best we could the counseling staff and the health staff. And of course, all of this is in the context of about a 2% reduction in total students, which we've been seeing the last several years. So it makes sense that there would be some reduction in FTE, but obviously this is back to a very core number because we were unsure of what our actual budget situation was going to be when we started this process. Now the next slide actually shows these reductions by school. So you can easily see where your school is. It's interesting because it reduces Capshawn to Vargas and adds Milagro, so you'll probably note that on there. But you can just take a quick look at that, and you can see, the impacts from the process that the teams went through, the principal and the school advisory council and the district team on coming up with those budgets.
And at this time, we'd like to have some select principals come forward and just talk to you a little bit about, I think they each have been allocated about 2 minutes each or so to talk about what the impacts have been to their schools. You can see those numbers, but it's good to hear from them. So for the Santa Fe High School feeder for elementary, we have Kate Diaz and Jewel Scoglin.
Good evening. Thank you for having us here. I'm Kate Diaz, principal at Adelia Elementary School.
And I'm Jalea Skoglund. I'm the principal at Salazar Elementary. Okay, we'll just go over a brief summary of the schools in our area that feed into Santa Fe High, the elementary schools, and let you know that'll be, go ahead.
The schools that feed right now to Santa Fe High School are Sequia Madre, Salazar, EJ, Carlos Gilbert, Kearney, Amy Beal, Nava, Tesuque, Chaparral, Wood Gormley, Pinon, and Adelia.
Okay, and out of those schools, Pinon had to cut 0.1 FTE in art, 0.1 FTE in PE. They did not have any coaches, and they also had to cut noon duty by 3 sessions. Carlos Gilbert had to reduce reading interventionist from 0.8 to a 0 FTE, library paraprofessional 1.0 to a 0.
These are on the slides here, so if you could speak slowly if you want to take notes on where that.
Will do. Sorry about that.
No, I thought, guys,
Trying to get through it in 2 minutes.
And we actually can maybe provide you some slides on that if you want. I mean, we can.
well, not tonight you can't.
Yeah, we probably could.
Just goes directly.
Okay, whatever.
Okay, Pinon, 0.1 FTE in art cut, 0.1 FTE in PE. Noon duty.
Full-time equivalency, if people don't know what FTEs are, they're, so a full-time person is 1.0. So if you cut it to a 0.5, that person is cut back to half-time. Just a friendly reminder to all of us, myself in particular, to watch the acronyms.
Noon duties were decreased by 3 sessions for Pinon. Carlos Gilbert reduced their reading interventionist from a 0.8 to 0. Reduced their library paraprofessional from a 1.0 FTE to 0. The school counselor from 0.4 to 0.3. The registered nurse from 0.6 to 0.2. And the noon duty personnel were cut from 3 down to 2. For Salazar, we had to cut 2 full-time instructional coaches, and all specials were cut from full-time employees to 0.8 with 4 days a week. And that actually is also supplemented by Title I. So from out of the operational, we had to cut it from 1.0 to 0.7, and then we supplemented. Band is being cut completely. I have to say, just a little thing, that our coaches have been instrumental this year. As I entered into the Santa Fe district, I was assigned to Salazar, which I love. It was an F school when I came, and over the summer, we found out the grade, and they had increased it to a C. I feel that the coaches were an extra blessing, and most schools aren't fortunate enough to have coaches. So they were instrumental this year in helping us to implement school-wide objectives. So cutting 2 coaches is a really big deal for us because they're instrumental in helping us achieve our goals. EJ Martinez cut their library assistant. 1 full-time library assistant has been cut, and 1 full-time special ed lead teacher has been cut at EJ Martinez. At Nava, 1 full-time instructional coach has been cut, and a nurse was cut from 0.4 to 0.2. Chaparral Elementary, 2 full-time instructional coaches have been cut, 2 full-time educational paraprofessionals have been cut, 0.2 art, 0.2 PE, and 0.2 music have been cut. 1 full-time teacher at 6th grade has been cut. So that ends up with a larger class size for those teachers that are left. Amy Beal, 1 full-time kindergarten teacher was cut. Registered nurse, 0.4 down to 0.2, along with a lot of other material budgets being cut. Kearney cut 1 full-time instructional coach, 1 full-time educational assistant, and 0.5 truancy officer. Acequia Madre cut 0.4 math coach, 0.4 library paraprofessional, and sub money. Atalaya cut 1 full-time 6th grade teacher, which leaves them with 1 6th grade teacher in a class of 33, 1 full-time EA, 0.2 counselor, 0.1 nurse, 0.2 nurse's aide, and some supplies and substitute money. Tasuke had an overall 9.6% budget cut, with art teacher being cut from 0.4 to 0.3, PE from 0.4 to 0.3, band 0.3 to 0.1, counselor cut to 0, nurse cut to 0, EAs 2 full-time EAs cut to a 0.6, and noon duty cut to 0, along with supplies and materials. Wood Gormley had a reduction in 6.4% from last year's budget, with a reduction for PE and art. Parent committee is going to pitch in 0.2 FTE for art and music and PE. Reduction of 1 educational paraprofessional, reduction of a counselor, SAT leader of a full-time FTE to a 0.4 counselor. They never had any instructional coaches.
All right, so that's like just the numbers, but when we kind of spoke as a principal group last week at our PD, we kind of summarized it as, we can do these cuts, but it does take us to the
PD.
Our professional development, I'm sorry. But we see it as a cut in safety by the subs being cut, noon duty being cut, and having overcrowded classrooms. We see it as hurting our wellness in our schools. We would have less counselors in general, less nursing or health assistants, and then it hurts our delivery of instruction for those of them that had the money to, we had to limit the coaches and less teachers, and the instructional materials in some cases got reduced in order to make the balance the budget. I mean, they are all things that we can do, and it's in a bad budget climate, but they are things that hurt the elementaries that feed to Santa Fe High School.
Good evening. Yes, thank you. Tonight we're speaking on behalf of elementary schools located on the south side of town. And I'll go ahead and speak of the specifics to these particular schools. Teresa's going to talk about just overall the effects that it's having. So for Sweeney Elementary, they're creating and restructuring with multi-age classrooms and 4 grade levels. There's loss of substitute days, so we're budgeted for subs from 15 to 4. 1 0.0 FTE PE teacher is being reduced. Their librarian, full-time librarian, is being reduced. Their art teacher, this year they were at a 1.1. They're going to a 1.0. They're losing possibly 4 educational assistants. And then we have Pinon also on our list, but you heard them earlier. Some of their students will attend Capitol High School. For Ramitas Thomas, it's 1.0 secretary FTE, 1.6 classroom teachers, which will create combo classes, 0.2 art, 0.1 music. We currently pay for 2 personnel to cover lunch duty. That'll be reduced to 1. And our substitute days will be from 6, an allocation of 6 to 3. And we also saw a reduction in our health aid from a 0.8 to a 0.6. I don't know if I missed anything on your.
No, that looks good.
Okay.
It doesn't look good, but it looks there. Good evening, and thank you for having us. My name is Teresa Liebert, and I'm the principal at Sweeney Elementary. Our cohort of when we got together in our teams, we realized and we looked at why is their Santa Fe High's group so much bigger, but we realized in our little group of feeder schools, it's just Sweeney, Cesar Chavez, and Ramirez Thomas as K through 5 schools who feed to Ortiz, who then eventually feed to Capitol High because we've got the K through 8s on our side. And of course, Pidion splits between the 2 high schools. More so than just the numbers, because the numbers really hurt the numbers. But when you add all those numbers up, that's what Carl talks about. I would like to talk about the loss of programming at our Southside schools, where dual language and bilingual programs are essential to the education of these students on our side of town. This budget, what this really looks like and feels like, it's the loss of the integrity of our dual language and bilingual programs. In order to, Carl was talking about the unit value, and every student starts with 1 unit, and then they build on that depending on the need and the type of student. Our students sometimes gain a lot of extra points, if you will, on that unit value because not only are they a student, but they are also a Title I, lower socioeconomic status, and also bilingual. Sometimes they're also in the special ed realm. And so these students are weighted very heavily, meaning we have a lot of needs. In our bilingual programs, no matter what the model is that we use, we don't lower the PTR, the pupil-teacher ratio. We continue to have as big as classes as anybody, but it requires a special training of teachers. It requires a special model in which we shift kids and we teach our kids a little bit differently so that we can make sure we can maintain the two languages. Nurturing the primary language in order to get the second language even more fluent and proficient. It takes a long process and a long model to develop. I feel that the 3 of us in our schools, we are in a trajectory, an upward trajectory. We've seen our test scores go higher. We've seen our school grades go higher from Fs, all of us were Fs, and now we're not. We're up into the Cs and B ranges. It's because of the program models and the time that we're taking to nurture the students in the very special way that they deserve. That is what we're looking at as far as cuts. It's the loss of the ability to build upon the programs that we already have in place and that we're trying to get better at, because we are going from good to great, and we're going to go from great to even better. It breaks, or at least significantly delays, the long-range goals and plans and vertical alignment that all 3 of us, including Ortiz, and then also including to Capitol High, that vertical alignment that we're trying to create. The loss of staff and the loss of programming will be a significant hit to us. And the loss of instructional supplies and materials is also a huge chunk, not just in personnel. Where we highly rely on our federal funds like Title I or our bilingual funds to help us not only fund some of our coaches, but some of those supply needs. If we're looking at the possibility of reducing that as well, that feels like a secondary cut to us as well. And we wanted to show you what that really looks like besides just in numbers. It's the loss of things that we've been building upon, what's helping the South Side come up and helping Santa Fe Public Schools. One thing I know personally, as far as principals' workload, it takes a lot to create our budgets, because sometimes we have to work with creating a budget like a patchwork quilt. You don't have enough in any one, so you take a little bit from here, a little bit from there, and before you know it, you've created maybe one position, And it's a nightmare for our poor accountants and our business services because they say, well, how many different line items do you have? And piecing together someone with that integrity it's very, very difficult to have a full program. Thank you very much.
President Price and members of the board and Superintendent Garcia, thank you for having us here tonight. I'm Ann Darnton, the principal of El Dorado Community School, and I will speak about 4 of the 5 K-8s, and then Principal Lane will speak about his school and add a few other comments. Before I go into the specific reductions that everyone made, I just want to mention that it was really, in speaking with our K-8 group, it was really obvious that everyone's effort was to keep the impact away from classroom and instruction, and yet still have schools that function and thrive. And we're very different. We are different sizes, we have different resources, different parent communities, and resources within those communities as well. So we each are doing different things to try to make that happen for our schools while dealing with having to make reductions. For Nina Otero, 1 classroom FTE, 0.6 music FTE, 1.0 technology teacher, 0.5 secretary, 1.0 instructional coach. And again, within that budget, I know their principal wanted to mention that there will be some shifting of those things to title budgets. So it's taken out of operational, but it may be shifted elsewhere in the end. Their school also took a very huge loss to a professional development budget in order to maintain some of those positions they're taking out of the operational budget. And that is, as Principal Liebert spoke, a really devastating loss to the development of program and professionalism in teachers. Gonzalez, 1.0 middle school FTE, 1.0 interventionist FTE. For Aspen, 1.0 reading coach, 1 classroom FTE. For El Dorado, 1 classroom FTE, 0.4 secretary FTE, 0.4 reading EA, and then 0.2 music FTE. For our school, we also had to make significant reductions last year and lost an instructional coach and several FTE as a result of how the Fair Student Funding formula played out for our school.
Good evening, School Board President Price and Dr. Garcia and other school board members and council here. My name is Jack Lane, and I'm the principal at El Camino Real. We are the largest of the K-8 schools and one of the few schools that have gone up in population this year, not significantly, pretty much the same as last year, but still have to work with cuts. We lost 1 FTE this year. We're still trying to figure out how to hold on to a half-time nurse assistant to work with our full-time nurse, which is very important for our community of students with from families with less resources than other schools. And also, we've been cutting our noon duty staff as well. What I keep hearing from different schools, whether wherever you are, it seems to me that you're having to reach into funds that normally aren't being used to be spent for those areas, whether you have a strong PTA that has strong funds, or whether you have more Title I money and federal funds like my school has. You're going into these areas that often are used for instructional supports, for instructional materials, being used for after-school programs, which my school depends on from our families, and tutoring support. And that's really what we're looking at cutting at my school this year, because we did have to reach into Title I to provide the EA support, especially in kindergarten, that we're required to provide. So that's the most significant impact at my school, and it seems to be from what I'm hearing from many of the other principals. Thank you.
Good evening, Board.
1 second,
Go ahead.
please. I would like to, it's becoming difficult for us to hear clearly what's going on here, so can I ask that you please keep your side conversations down? Thank you. We're old.
Madam President Price, board members, Superintendent Dr. Garcia, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. When talking with Principal Sena, we're looking at Ortiz. I'll just go through what their cuts are first and our cuts. Over at Ortiz, they're in jeopardy of losing their assistant principal and a secretary, and their substitutes are days are reduced from 7 to 5, and their reduction in noon duty. Now, I haven't had a principal in ever, and I know how hard that is. So I feel for Principal Sena. For Milagro, it's a little bit different. Doing the quick math up there from the Capshaw and DeVargas, what their loss would be to the gain that was at Milagro, it was about it was about 8 full teachers there. But I went into my budget defense and came out with no instructional coach or interventionist, no professional development available to create a new middle school, and went down 3 full-time teachers. So, and also, I also came out of there with the limiting my ability to offer a variety of electives to align to the high school, because when we decided to do these boundary changes, it was to help Ortiz and DeVargas, or Milagro, to help feed the high schools in a proper manner. So if Ortiz is supposed to feed to Capital, they should be able to offer programs like medical and business and digital design and film production, because those are the academies. Principal Sena really cannot do that because of her reduction in FTE and everything, and not being able to supplement that. On my side with Milagro, I can't offer culinary arts and humanities classes, or innovative classes. I just spoke with a wonderful candidate for innovative classes that would help introduce these academy electives. There's no way I'll be able to even think of offering that young man a job. But then there's also the other things that we will not be able to offer. We won't be able to offer AVID. We won't be able to offer technology, and we won't be able to definitely offer home ec. So this is like deja vu all over again for me, coming from California, because in 2000, a class action suit was filed by Eliezer Williams to the state of California and the Department of Education there. And he won. It was called the Williams Act. And on the basis of that lawsuit was that agencies failed to provide public school students with equal access to instructional materials, safe and decent school facilities, and qualified teachers. Our teachers were supposed to get new adoption of language arts. Middle school did, secondary, all secondary. High school did not. And middle school seems to be the one that's the cutting point for far too long. We either lose it because elementary needs it, or we lose it because the high school needs it. And we keep on preaching that the walls don't make the program makes the program. We don't even have the stuff for the program. We don't have it. So I think that's it, unless I thought I got something else.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Dana Richards for Alternative High School.
Hi, Superintendent. Hi, board members. Hi, community. So there's a little bit I need to say about the context for ECO. We're brand new. It's a trade school. The cost of a trade school, I think, are inherently high. We have a group of students with significant behavioral and academic challenges. Trade schools, of course, have unique safety issues. And then the materials, the supply side of running a trade school is significant. Also this year, in terms of context, our teachers all voluntarily taught 6 classes rather than 5 classes. Typical high school teachers, as you know, teach 5 classes. That's not sustainable. I watch them get extremely stressed from that. So our baseline FTE isn't what you might think. It's actually larger. And this year, we underfunded counseling. For example, I had 0.14 in this year's budget for counseling, and 0 EAs, and a single security officer, which seemed to make sense right up until when all the students showed up. So from that perspective, we're looking at a 20% budget cut to serve the same number of students. That's a 2.5 FTE reduction in instructional FTE. That's a 50% reduction in our supply budget. And if you add the reductions for social workers, mentor and volunteer coordination, dual credit coordination, and what I call project technical and logistical support, because we're doing things like building homes and a lot of large-scale hands-on projects. That's a total of another 1.5 in FTE reduction. So those are the big ticket items in terms of the shift for us. Some people might perceive that we were overfunded this year, but if you think about what the needs of a trade school is and what this unique safety and supply needs are, we probably can't in shop classes have the same class size ratios that you might have in more conventional academic classes. So thank you.
Of high schools, Carl Morano and Chanel Wilson Segura.
Okay, good evening, Madam President, School Board, and Dr. Garcia. As a comprehensive high school, when we were first allocated our school budgets, I think Mr. Morano and I were in a state of shock as our combined schools were being asked to cut $2 million. And so with that, we began looking at our enrollment summaries and comparing the move. So with that, at Capitol High School, we have seen an increase in enrollment every year since 2012. We projected this to happen because the south side of Santa Fe is expanding. There wasn't much as far as building new houses, but what we came to find out is we have multiple families living in single residence homes, which at that point increased our enrollment. With that, the district did a rezoning effort to try to alleviate the high enrollment at Capitol High School. Unfortunately, we don't have the space facility-wise to house as many as the 1,500 students that we had this year. So in the rezoning effort to send more students to Santa Fe High School, we were hoping to see a decrease. However, we're looking at maintaining, if not having an increase for this next year. So we're really struggling with how to provide the same program, even if we were to narrow it down and still meet the needs of kids. So the high schools, what we've experienced is we've had what I think the school board and our superintendents have asked us to do, is to make more families in the Santa Fe community choose public school and to provide opportunities for our kids and our families to be able to succeed and have opportunities after high school. So we've done that, and I think we've done it very well. We've received many transferring students from St. Michael's, Mandela, ATC, Monte del Sol, Tierra Encantada, and as well as out-of-district students, which has increased our enrollment and is not included in the projections that we are given in our budgets. Also, both high schools have more students enrolling from out of country. I know for a fact that Capital High School has experienced a minimum of 100 additional students from out of country each year. That comes with high cost as far as how to support our kids who are EL students, the majority.
EL, just clarify, please.
English learners, and the resources to support them to graduate in 4 or 5 years. Because of that, we kind of look at what is our plan for our newcomers and our newcomer families and students within our district, because we feel that the burden is falling on schools. What we did here is we kind of broke it out. All the high school principals broke it out, and here's a document that you all can take to look at later. We broke it out into 7 different areas of concern. So the first one was enrollment. The second is personnel. A reduction in FTE will increase our class sizes that are already high, compromise fidelity of programming, and create situations that make it difficult to comply with the restrictions of the CBA. The collective bargaining agreement. Thank you. And in high school, we have credit-bearing courses, which means that there are master schedule constraints, which makes it very difficult to make sure that you're creating a student-driven schedule and not a teacher-driven schedule, which I think both high schools have done a very good job of creating to meet the needs of kids. We also are concerned with greater teacher and principal turnover in our high schools due to these increased levels. The third one is safety and security. We've had to reduce our number of security guards and student supports to ensure appropriate supervision and intervention, which is concerning. We've had to cut substitute budget, which leads to our schools scrambling to get classes covered when they're not picked up by substitutes, and also a cut in counseling services and wraparound services. Being a Title I high school, and Carl's not far behind at Santa Fe High School, we need counselors. And it's not to work on student schedules, it's to deal with the day-to-day crises that take place in their lives, to make sure that they can come to school and be safe. The fourth is instructional capacity. So with that, we're constrained to maximum loads for teachers, as well as 27-to-1 ratios for English language arts, as well as Algebra 1. We are fearful that principals' focus will change from being instructional leaders to logistical managers due to cut in FTE, security, counselors, and school supports. Cut in instructional coaches has also been made to support the implementation of instructional priorities in the classroom. Won't happen, and again will be become the responsibility of the principal. The fifth is program adjustments, which is I think one of the most powerful one that will be hit. So with the high schools, we're being asked to follow the New Mexico Public Education Department career cluster pathways and their guidance documents, which directly affect our A through F school report cards. Whether or not we give credence to those report cards, that's what people look at, and that's what we strive to improve each year. With that as well is Carl Perkins Grant Career Pathway Completers. If we cut into our outside of our academic core and into our elective course offerings, we will it will have an adverse effect on our career pathways, and we won't be having those pathway completers. Also, both schools have the AVID program. Capital High School is the only AVID National Demonstration School in the state of New Mexico. We will lose we will lose that designation if we can't afford the tutors and the required staff professional development during the summer. Advanced placement was also a priority at one point. If we don't make our minimum enrollment of 15 students per course, that will also be cut. That has been a highlight for many private school families, is to get, we've enticed them with the many advanced placement course offerings at both of the comprehensive high schools, so we would hate to see those be cut. Also, at Capital High School, we have had a freshman intervention program. Every student is involved in freshman seminar, which is modeled after AVID 9. We felt very strongly that AVID 9 did right by our kids and provided them with the supports that they needed. And so we opened it up to all students. And what we've seen is an increase of 9th graders promoting to the 10th grade from 60% to 85% because of this intervention. That will be cut in this proposal. Music and art programming has also been cut to maintain the academic core, which is math, English, and science and social studies, and then athletics as well. Another thing that hits the high schools is intervention, and that's another area. So credit recovery during the school day, after school, summer school will be, we won't be able to fund that, which will not afford students the opportunity to get back on track for graduation. Our graduation rates will drop due to lack of opportunity to recover credit, even though our students, what we've witnessed is that our students have been persisting in school instead of dropping out. And this will also affect our A through F report card. And then overall, just the student and staff mental well-being and attendance. There's going to be heightened, there already is heightened staff and student anxiety and depression within our communities, decreased engagement and motivation to stay in school, increase in truancy. We've done such a tremendous job as a district to increase our attendance. We're going to see a hit in that, high teacher turnover, and increased dropout rate. So those are some of the concerns that we see as we move forward with the current budget state.
Thank you, Chanel. I just want to summarize it all for you and just kind of put it in clearer terms as we generalized it there. But so combined between the two high schools, we were definitely hit the hardest with this proposed budget. So in essence, combined with the two schools, we're at a loss of about $1 million total, which affects the following. 1 assistant principal, 11 FTE combined of the two schools, a counselor each, a security guard each, a combined 2.5 FTE in music, a combined $60,000 in supplies, combined 3 deans of students or school student support, 1 instructional coach, 2 EAs, and 4 sub days. I just want to say that being my first year as principal at the high school and working closely with Chanel and the teamwork that we've collaborated all of this year, I know, in speaking with her, I have had probably over 100 students in the last 2 months wanting to shadow at Santa Fe High from these various private schools. And we know that we're drawing kids back to the high schools, back to the public high schools. Chanel's been doing a great job for the last few years. And we know they're not choosing to come to Santa Fe High because of math, or because of science, or because of English, or because of of history. Okay. What are they choosing the high schools for? Our culinary arts, our Innovate, the wonderful medical program at Capitol High School. With this, we could really drastically affect these great programs that really have drawn our students, keep our students really engaged and wanting to be at school. And so that's our fear. So thank you for listening to us today, and appreciate it.
To just put a face to that $3.1 million that you've seen 3 times now. If you go to the next slide, please, Carl. So just want to be clear that these are possible cost savings options. When we started the process, again, we didn't know if we were going to be at a $5 million or $9 million cut. We are looking at here, 3.1 million. Later, when you look at options, that number could change depending on the options that you select, and that will become clear at the end of the presentation. The next cost savings option was consolidation of alternative high school programs. And Carl, do you want to talk to that?
Sure. Thank you, Superintendent. For some time, this has been an option for the district as the alternative high school programs evolved. It ended up being the #1 item on the employee survey.
And
So
Carl, you have a different slide, because this has evaluated for Nava and Alvord. And yours doesn't have that.
Well, yeah, we'll get to
Okay,
that.
just talk to that, please.
Right.
That's not up there.
Okay. All right. So again, the high school, the alternative high school programs was an opportunity for savings, and it was seen by many in the district. And so the three programs that are being evaluated for consolidation are listed above: the Academy, Engage, and Bridge, that are in different locations now and in different facility situations. They all have a reliance on technology-based programs, which are critical to their blended learning strategy. And a number of facility options have been evaluated that Ms. Yondo Wagner will review here in just a few minutes. But the numbers actually come out from this evaluation of savings largely in administration and some consolidation of leveraging teaching staff across the programs. And you can see what that is. And that's approximately $450,000.
Let's go to the next slide. So we looked at various options for relocation, and Krista, you want to talk about that?
Good evening, Board President Price, board members, Superintendent Garcia. We've known that we need an alternative school location for some time, and that is related primarily to the displacement of Academy at Latagoite for the relocation of Mandela, which is a result of the rebuilding of our Llano Street campus for Milagro Middle School. So we have been looking for several months for a location for the Academy, and at some point in time, Linda Sink and Will Wade began to join me to look at options that might house multiple programs. We looked at 3 city properties. We met with city staff. We visited multiple times these locations. We met with Santa Fe Community College staff. We looked at the Higher Ed Center. We looked at the college itself. We looked at Santa Fe Public School properties, not limited to the elementary schools or the soon-to-be vacant property that I'll be speaking to this evening. Next slide, please. I did ask for one of our district partners to join us, Ms. Sarah Gerhardt. Will be speaking to a couple of slides coming up, but she's a senior facility planner from Architectural Research Consultants. She's a registered architect with a focus in education. When we have facility issues related to program, related to enrollment, demographics, geography, I call on ARC because they offer us many services across many disciplines. But Ms. Gerhardt and I were in a very short time frame able to look at available facilities, and we'll talk about why these facilities may become available or aren't available later in the presentation. But we are really looking for a good match for alternative programs in Santa Fe Public Schools. And it so happens that of the 3 elementary schools we've studied in most recent discussions, Nava, Chaparral, and E.J. Martinez, that Nava is the best fit from a capital planning, enrollment, program, and location standpoint for the reasons listed here. Next slide, please. We also looked at a soon-to-be vacant property. As you know, Alvord School has been leased by Tierra and Quintada, and that lease, by their request, will terminate in June. The Alvord School was not considered initially for alternative school programs or really any alternative use because it, not unlike some of our other facilities, meets the criteria for full replacement. It is very dense in its capital improvement project lists and has many issues that would be hard to overcome for any user. So at the direction of the board, we have chosen to list Alvord property for sale. But given that it's very possible that we don't have a location to relocate our alternative programs, therefore we wouldn't be able to realize the operational savings Mr. Grunler spoke to, we did study the Alvord campus for potential use of alternative school programs, perhaps just in the near term to get us to another decision-making point in the future. Again, Ms. Gerhardt and I looked at this facility together, and our findings are here on the slide. Both facilities, in short, could provide the program space, the program separation. NAVA is the only one that has the current technology infrastructure to meet the alternative program needs. They're largely computer and internet-based. They require things to be downloaded in a large capacity. It's a very complex need that we'd have to overcome at Alvord. There are probably parking issues on both campuses, and there's systems issues on both campuses. It just so happens that Alvord has much greater need than Nava at this point in their facility cycle. Next slide.
So the possible savings, again, these are all possible, from the consolidation of the 3 alternative high school programs, operational dollars, we're not talking about capital dollars, is about $500,000, $0.45 million. Just very quickly, when we looked at athletics, now we can ask for clarification at the high schools when they talk about athletics. I'm assuming that it might be an assistant coach or travel or stipends. I don't think we're not cutting any athletic programs, but from the district budget, after we reviewed it and looked at where could we see any kinds of efficiencies, we felt that we just didn't see any. So there's 0 here in terms of district budget cuts at the for athletics. The rollback of principal contracts was one that was in the top 4 in the survey. There's a variety of reasons why we extend the principal contracts, but if this were a cost savings option, it would save $100,000. So next, we've talked a lot about, it took a lot of time. We've had 2 forums and 1 impromptu forum here on the closures of schools. And we think it's important for everyone, because we've never had an opportunity to present on this, to have the historical context of the capital planning challenges that we face in our district. So I'm going to turn it back to our Chief Operations Officer to give this part of the presentation.
Thank you again, Superintendent. What follows is a series of slides and information that's been gathered over many years, very intensely studied in the last few weeks. But these are realities and conditions that have faced Santa Fe Public Schools as long as I've been the Chief Operations Officer, which is 7 years. Many of them have existed longer, maybe 2 or 3 general obligation bond cycles. And so why would these be important to your study session tonight? The information gathered here around facilities, capital planning, school boundaries, school enrollment is closely related to budget, obviously. And there are many pieces of facts and information that led us to the conclusion that closing 2 schools could save some money for various reasons. And it could also solve some problems or issues that we've been facing for some time. So I'm going to speak to these 3 issues, and generally you hear on this decreased funding issue from me about once a year. I come in this spring, I get 1 slice of a budget session, roughly in April or May, where I talk about the challenges of keeping our school facilities maintained. For the last several years, I've been speaking to you about the challenges of doing more with less money. Our mill levy funds have been reduced over the last several years. 7 years ago, I was operating with 40% more money. Our Director of Facilities and Maintenance is currently maintaining all of our school district facilities with less than $10 million a year. If I'd been presenting in 2010, I had roughly $17 million to push out to our facilities to keep them repaired and maintained.
40% less, correct?
40% less. So in addition, because of a really vibrant capital plan implementation, and because of a lot of need district-wide, we've continued to build new facilities and build facilities where there are students, which we'll talk again about in a minute. We've added 500,000 square feet. So not only have our monies been less, but our square footage is more. And this is in part because our mill levy funds are being directly allocated to our charter schools, but it is in a large part because our home valuations decreased a couple of years ago, and so in total, the money coming into the school district is simply less in the areas of mill levy. For similar reasons, we have a decrease, we've seen a decrease over 3 bond cycles in the general obligation bond category. Again, this builds and contributes to bricks and mortar improvements, renovation, replacement of schools, new school buildings. And in 2010, when I came on, we were executing a $160 million bond. This 2017 bond passed in February is for $100 million. We have more facilities, we have more need, we have less money. A second issue that we've been dealing with over the last several years is a shift in location, primarily of our elementary school students, but I think we're feeling it somewhat at the middle, K-8, and high school level as well. Since 2002, the reason we'll really focus on elementary, let me just go back a second, is because of the school closure issue and that we are discussing that at the elementary level. So I don't want to gloss over this and lead you to believe this isn't an issue across other grade levels. But since 2002, there's been a 57% increase in students in the southwest part of town. I'll show you that on a map in a minute, and that's just at the elementary level. And that is primarily because that is where we have provided affordable housing for our families. So that's not just a school district issue, that's a city issue. There's been a significant decrease in recent years in the students in El Dorado. Since we were on that building project in 2010, reopened the facility as a K-8 in 2012, we have seen a decline in the enrollment there. In the north, northeast, and central parts of town, it's been relatively flat at the elementary school level, but we still have more buildings in those parts of town because we just simply haven't caught up in the south and the southwest parts. We have excess facility seats. What that means is there's additional capacity in many of our schools. And in general, we have decreasing enrollment across the district. Next slide. So this is flipped somehow. This is going to be awkward. How will we do this? Everybody will lay down for a minute. So I'm not sure how that happened. We'll work on it. I think the board is fortunate to have it in front of them. It's going to make it really hard to get my pointer in the right direction. But this map more or less articulates all the things we just talked about. If you look specifically in the northeast part of town, there are 671 students at the elementary school level, and we have 5 school buildings. Okay, so those are students living in that area of town. And I'm going to walk you through a couple of examples.
Can you hold on a second? I think Elias is going to try to flip it for you. Can you just give him
Are
30
you quick?
seconds?
30 seconds? Okay.
Can you just put it to one slide? He can't, he just has to change the layout.
Great. Thank you. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Okay, everyone can sit right back up. So the purpose of this map is really to provide you a tool. So we use tools like this all the time to study issues, and we've been using this tool. We used it in 2010 to make a recommendation to build a new school, Nino Otero. So it's really a tool for studying the issue around schools, where students are, where our population increases are. And so I was going to walk you through a couple of examples, and then you can use the map on your own to study some issues. But as I was saying, if we just look in one area of town, I'll give you a couple of quick examples. In the northeast area of town, the top number tells you how many elementary school students live there. Okay? The first parenthesis shows you the increase in the number of students since 2002. The second number in parentheses shows you the number of elementary school only seats, so the capacity in the schools. And then the black dots are the schools. So there's 4 elementary here pictured, and then Tasuke goes off the map, and that will be the 5th school. If you look at El Dorado, you can see the decrease in students in the area. If you look at the south side of town, this is an issue I've been talking about for some time when I come to you to speak about boundaries. We have 2 schools at this point in time where Santa Fe Public Schools is able to enroll their elementary school students. And this is Amy Beale and Pinon. And look at the number of students we have in the area. Right now, we are able to capture that overflow because of the Turquoise Trail Charter School accepting many of those students, but we're seeing a continual uptick in the amount of students enrolled at Amy Beale. I'll just draw your attention to then the southwest part of town where we've been talking about this increase since 2002. That's the 57% increase I talked about. And until we built Nino Otero, we didn't even have that many dots there, but we have 4 dots there now in the area. Okay?
Dots being schools.
Schools, thank you. Next slide. Our final condition, and so I mentioned there were 3, right? One is decreased funding, one is a shift in the placement of our students. The final one that Ms. Gerhardt and I will speak to tonight is something we spend essentially a year studying every 5 years. So it's not something we've just looked at over the last couple of weeks. It's something that we are required by the Public Schools Facility Authority to do, and it's called a Facility Master Plan. We recently updated in 2017. What it articulated is many things about facilities, many things about our geography, our demographics, our enrollment, and Sarah will talk in the next slide about the team of people we truly bring in to do this comprehensive body of work.
And that's really critical because I know that sort of like, well, it's your own plan, so of course you're recommending it. We do rely on these experts. ARC has been an amazing partner because they do have the demographers, the architects, and so on that help inform these recommendations. Back to you, Chief Operations Officer.
Thank you, Superintendent. So some of the highlights really of the facility master plan we have here, we identified over $260 million in need district-wide across all facilities at all grade levels, including our adult facilities. And remember, I just told you we're bonding for $100 million in 2017. We identified 8 school facilities that met or nearly met the full criteria for replacement, and Sarah will talk about that in a minute. And we just realized in general, not realized, but we noted probably for the second or third facility master plan that the northeast and central part of town, our facilities are aging. They're up in the 50, they're nearing the 50, 60 year mark, 40, 50, 60 year mark. And the reality is many of them are at the end of their useful life. Next slide. This is what Superintendent Garcia was talking about. Facility master planning takes a team of people, hired architects, planners, engineers, and demographers. We are provided with multiple reports. They're in the left-hand column. They're reviewed by various sets of people. They're all vetted through the Citizens Review Committee, but not until they've gone to principals, school communities, our custodians, our facilities and maintenance staff, our construction management team. And Ms. Gerhardt brings with her to the table engineers, other architects, planners, demographers. I'll mention, I think Architectural Research Consultants has been doing our school boundaries and demographics for 20 plus years. Is that right?
I'm sure. I don't know the exact.
Yeah, it's been quite a long time, a long-standing relationship. So this more or less shows you the facility master planning process. And after what I mentioned was nearly a year-long process, Architectural Research Consultants gave us lots of information around our facilities with which we could study issues throughout the next 5-year bond cycle. So I would like Ms. Gerhardt to speak to the next slide, which is really about our facility conditions and why we chose some of the elementary schools to study.
Thank you, Christy. President Price and Dr. Garcia and members of the board. Okay. This slide is showing facility scores for all of the district's facilities, including both school facilities and administrative facilities. And ARC uses a scoring system to be able to compare schools to each other, or compare facilities to each other. It is more than a facility condition index study, which is standard for governmental buildings, because with school facilities, we're also interested in the ability of the site and to perform the functions that we need at our facilities, and we're also interested in the adequacy of the facilities for education. So we're looking at meeting certain educational standards above and beyond just whether or not you need a new roof. What you see in this, what this chart shows is that the district schools scoring above 80 is the majority of the list, and this is reflecting the investments that the district has made over the last 10 years. If you're looking in hindsight, the investments the district has made in these facilities all the way down that list to about Sweeney and Wood Gormley and Acequia Madre. And it shows that the also with the newer K-8 schools and the rebuilding of some of those elementary schools, the investments the district has made are showing it's reflecting the current investments. And what the facility master plan then focuses on the schools at the bottom of the list, scoring towards the lower half. I've highlighted the schools that are up for discussion at this meeting, but you'll notice that down in that group, the capital plan that was included in the facility master plan and approved as part of the recent bond list includes investments by the district for the next 5 years in those facilities. Yeah.
Hard for people to see. Would you say the names of the schools? That chart's harder. This one is easier, but for those in the audience that are looking at that, would you please state the ones? And then just clarify again, is a high number a good number, or is a low, what is, okay, the high number and the low number, just relatively, what does that mean?
A high number is a good number, and so the lower the number, the poorer the condition.
The greater need for renovation. And the higher number, like Nino Otero, it has a very high number. It's because it's a brand new school. Correct. And then the ones in yellow are schools that have lower numbers because of their facility needs. And just what are those schools that you highlighted?
The schools I've highlighted are Chaparral Elementary School, E.J. Martinez Elementary School, Nava Elementary School, and Alvord.
And then the ones that are not highlighted that fall in there, B.F. Young Professional Building, but obviously we wouldn't prioritize that, or at least we haven't, over a school. De Vargas, that's already been dealt with. The Academy at La Guaite, which is, again, being considered for renovation for Mandela. The Transportation Department office, I mean, that's going to have a lower priority than a school. And then I can't read and then of course Capshaw, which you dealt with. So just so that the audience gets a sense of those on the bottom and how they're being dealt with. Okay,
so Superintendent Garcia, I'd also like to just emphasize that if you look at the facility master plan recommendations, it was determined by ARC and by the Citizens Review Committee that it should be a priority this bonding cycle to study in particular Chaparral, E.J. Martinez, and Nava. We anticipated coming to this crossroads where the facility conditions were such that we needed to do significant or full replacements. We looked at the relationship between the three schools, their contiguous or connected boundaries, and the density in which students live in those areas, and recommended a study. So there was a small amount of money set aside in the 2017 general obligation bond funds to study this issue. We anticipated that study would take the form of perhaps a CRC or a Citizens Review Committee ad hoc committee that may be a representative group from these three communities, from the CRC, perhaps appointed by the board, would study this issue over a year or year and a half. Unfortunately, the financial climate that we found ourselves in this year accelerated our attention to this issue. So the issue still has to be discussed. It's the time at which we discussed it that became, much sooner than we thought it might be. We'll go through the next two slides. Briefly, we just want you to understand how you can read and compare these charts to one another to understand the facility conditions better and why they are the way they are.
The facility age is really explains why we're discussing these school facilities, these particular school facilities at this time. School facilities have an expected life cycle, and they're built, and their systems, their heating systems, their roofing systems, their plumbing systems also have a life cycle. And these school facilities, as you can see, are approaching the rebuild or replace. At the first red line, at about 25 years, between 20 and 25 years, the district invested in these schools and put new roofs on them, upgraded HVAC systems, did refurbishment of the school facilities somewhere to give the schools life to go through the next 25 to 30 years. So now we find ourselves, just based on life cycle, at a time when these school facilities need to have new investments. The table that's up above really reflects some of the capital needs that are in the improvement plan for each of the school facilities. These are issues that were raised by principals, by evaluators and architects during site visits, by the engineers during site visits. So the table highlights in gray deficiencies that show up as capital needs for for these particular facilities. And it's just to sort of graphically show where there are differences in needs between the different facilities. So for example, where Nava has a new roof on its main building, the other two don't. So that's what this chart is trying to show.
And for those that aren't able to see, that are far back, so the different things that they're looking at, health and safety, security, site, roof, what is IAQ?
That's indoor air quality.
So indoor air quality, for example, Chaparral, E.J. Martinez, that shows to replace, it just goes through HVAC, lighting to LED, energy use, and it just goes across that. This is available on the website. Anybody, of this whole presentation, you can print it or, review it so that you can study this. Keep going.
Next slide, please. So the purpose of the facility data summary is really to talk about that when we choose to study a school or a series of schools for replacement or reconfiguration, reuse, consolidation, closure, we're not just looking at one factor. So we're not just looking at the facility condition and the cost to replace it. Okay, that would be too narrow of a view. We're looking at projected enrollments, which is a column. We're looking at transfer rates, transfers in and out. We're looking at utilization, program capacity, all sorts of issues roll into the conversation. So we're not simply implying that because a school is perhaps too expensive or not attainable at this time to replace, that it's not a good idea. We have to weigh and measure these factors across multiple areas. Superintendent, would you like me to keep going, or would you like to introduce this?
So, one of the things that, and I think, time is really important. If we ideally had been looking at this, we had to study it because the board asked us to in a short amount of time. But we would be looking at boundaries. We have identified proposed boundaries if this were an option, and Christy will go, our Chief Operations Officer will go into that. But if this is done this year, there would be a supplemental interzone transfer lottery. If this was done in subsequent years, or if at all, there could be a priority lottery. exploring special ed cohorts when you see the proposed boundaries. I know that there are some very specialized special ed programs where we could move that program in a cohort. Trying to look at, and if a committee could be established, if this was done long-term, to look at what other things could be done to minimize the disruptive impacts to children and families, looking at the fiscal impact and academic and community impact. I do have a little bit of data that just came up recently. We still want to study this long-term, but I do have the reading proficiency of what happened with Aspen when they combined the schools, and looking at that comparison to the state. We didn't have time to really do an analysis for math or for the other school, but Aspen did take if you started where they were in 09 and 10, there was a dip in 2010, 2011, which was seen pretty much across the state. Then we took a further dip, but by 2012, 2013, actually Aspen was performing above the state average in reading. So just so that you have that bit of data. So, we will continue on with the presentation of looking at current boundary for the elementary schools. Chief Operations Officer, please.
Okay. So, when you're posed with a problem such as the budget crisis, you can study, again, an issue in a relatively quick manner. And through about 7 iterations, I think, we've looked at potential boundary changes if Santa Fe Public Schools were to close 2 schools, up to 2 schools. What you'll see over the next couple of slides is about our 5th pass at this process. We're looking at boundary changes from a geographical standpoint, enrollment, available seats, transportation. We're also trying to look at these academic and achievement impacts and the configuration of the schools. But what the current elementary school boundary map shows us is it's another articulation of the issue that we saw in a previous map. And that is that our students are increasingly in the southwest part of town, which isn't focused on as much in this map. As a matter of fact, we're focusing more in the area we're speaking to. But you'll see the large geographical boundary areas. And I'm going to highlight those over the next couple of slides. But for example, Atalaya, which is the purple to the far right, actually goes off the page. It takes a lot of geographical area to capture even a small number of students to go to the school. And so what happens in the areas of town where, combined there's 571 students, we rely heavily on an aggressive transfer process to keep those schools enrolled. Next slide, please. I took apart the 3 schools that we've been talking about over the last several weeks and visited in regards to possible closures for school savings and gave you a little bit more information. What this is it's a map. Again, these are created by architectural research consultants. They're tied directly to our student data system. So what they show us is several things. First of all, the gray shaded area is the chaparral boundary. The dots represent students, and if they're too close to one another, there'll be several in a pile. So it's not one student per red dot. It might be multiple students. And so what this shows us is that in a school boundary that's 2.375 square miles, approximately 267 students live and attend in this gray area at Chaparral. We also know, based on data that we've posted online, 50 students transfer out of the school, 96 transfer in. There's over 300 enrolled. And so these are things we're studying to understand whether or not, combined with facility conditions, budget, and other issues, there are school consolidation or closure options in schools with close relationships to one another. Next slide, please. No, it's 0.08. Yes. So this is Nava. Again, I mentioned I did it for the 3 schools in the study. This is their boundary. It's less than 1 square mile. We know that in this little area, 122 students live and attend, and they actually walk to school because I don't provide transportation to the school, so they walk or they get driven. There are 72 transfers into the school and 31 transfers out. So this is some information, and pieces of it articulated on this map, and other bits of it are online in other enrollment and transfer information. Next slide, please. This is the boundary for E.J. Martinez. And up here, I should have mentioned on the prior slides, close to the name is a larger marking that indicates where the school is. So the school is roughly in this area of the map. This is a 17.61 square mile boundary. And what has happened is that over the years, because of our shift in population and because of changes in the density of where our students live, this boundary has started to stretch. I don't know how many years ago it started touching the El Dorado boundary, but these students here are actually closer to Chaparral, but they drive past or continue on and go on to E.J. Martinez. These students here, the dots represented south of I-25, this is roughly the Rabbit Road area and Seton Village, for those of you who are familiar with those areas. So this is an example of something I showed you with Atalaya or El Dorado. Our boundary, our geography changes because of the shifting location of our students across Santa Fe.
I think you had mentioned that El Dorado was closer, I guess, at bottom boundary, right, for some of those students?
You know, I haven't, Superintendent, measured the exact mileage of the trip, the distance to travel from here to El Dorado or here to E.J. Martinez. But the issue is that we do run a bus to El Dorado along this road. We run a bus in the other direction to Atalaya. And so I'll show you in a minute in our proposed boundaries why we would choose one school over the other, should that be something we consider. I did forget to mention, somebody flagged me here, 191 students live and attend in this boundary. 191 students live and attend in the boundary, 65 transfer in, 78 transfer out. Okay, next slide, please. In a typical school boundary change process, we would bring a proposal like this to you, the Board of Education, then we'd go out and have public meetings and come back to you with feedback. So it's typically a 3 to 5 month process. We start it in the fall and move through it as quickly and efficiently as we can. But this proposal is what would typically be our starting point. So we would certainly want to entertain feedback before this became a boundary that we adopt. But this shows how Nava and EJ, which are touching many other schools, become a part of the Chaparral, Wood Gormley, Aspen, El Dorado, Salazar, and Kearney communities. And we'll look at a next slide that shows us a little more closely what that means. The schools are listed here, and what we have in parentheses is the number of students that would be reassigned from the various areas. So if you go back and study the map, E.J. Martinez would be divided between Aspen, Wood Gormley, Chaparral, and El Dorado. Nava would be divided between Salazar and Kearney. I want to speak to this for a minute. We worked diligently to make sure that the new school assignments were within capacity of the school buildings we're sending them to. There are a couple of breaks through capacity in the early years. That happens. It's happening at Nino Otero or El Camino Real, one or the other right now. It's a reality of evening out boundaries over a series of enrollment years. But we looked at the longer range projections before making these recommendations. We also worked diligently with Mr. Grunler and our Strategy and Accountability Office to determine the number of staff that would have to travel with these students. And I know he has that number, I think, on an upcoming slide. Interestingly, the schools really needed very few teachers to absorb these students, and no one was going to exceed you know, their class sizes per our collective bargaining agreement or our state standards to an excessive level, an unnecessary level. So I think Mr. Grunler wants to talk about that, but we were very cognizant that, you know, the goal wasn't to suddenly impose some undue stress on the receiving schools. As a matter of fact, speaking to only a couple of these principals, because really we would want to work to operationalize this as a team, folks are very happy about receiving new students and the opportunities that brings to their schools, to their school community, to their increase in services. In a matter of an hour's time, we sat with the principal at Aspen, and he was able to operationalize this very logically in his mind and provide opportunities for both his students and any new incoming students. So we were very careful in studying these. We also did not imply that any transfers would have to be revoked from the receiving schools. So we sent students back to their home schools. If a student's attending NAVA currently on a transfer, their reassignment would be their home boundary. But we didn't revoke any transfers at Salazar or Kearney to make room for these NAVA students. Next slide, please. So again, this is just a side-by-side as a matter of study.
Possible, again, all of this is just possible, all the cuts that we've shown, these are not recommendations at this point. School closure impact, the fiscal impact, the number did change considerably because we're finished with the study. The first numbers that were presented were estimates, best guess estimates. This was disaggregated down to the student level, and it was very time-consuming but very accurate work. And Mr. Grandler, if you want to just go over the slide.
Thank you, Superintendent. I'll just touch on this. You can see from the principal, secretary, library assistant, you know, those are pretty easy calculations. The custodian at E.J. Martinez would be on a savings list because it would be closed under this scenario. NAVA would not, so that would still have a custodian. Now, the biggest piece of it is the teaching staff. And this is the part that took so much analysis on where the kids would go, and then the number of students per grade that would be added to the multiple schools, and then an assessment on whether we were needing to add a teacher in those grades or not. And so for the 24 teachers between NAVA and EJ, we found that 9 teachers would have to be added, and the savings would be 15, and they all fit within the CBA, and it just points to the undercapacity at many of our schools that were able to absorb the transfer for children. For example, Salazar didn't need a teacher at all, and I think it had the most students transferred in.
One of the things that's been striking to me is being new to the district as superintendent is that it's apparent, regardless of how we look at it, or you want to slice it and dice it, that we have more elementary seats available to the ratio of students. Right. And we have declining enrollment is the other issue that has impacted our budget, is the declining enrollment.
Right. And then with the specials teachers, which would be art, music, and PE, we assumed that half of the FTE from NAVA and EJ would be needed at those schools that the students would be moving towards. There's an annual utility cost for EJ, property insurance cost. And then the note, I think, is important. We assume that all the student support costs for counselors, nurses, and health aides, plus the materials and supplies that are in the budgets for NAVA and EJ would be allocated to the receiving schools.
So the proposed possible cost savings would be total annual savings and would be recurring is $1.52 million. So next, we'll go to the next option, which was 4-day school week. And what we looked at the maximum potential savings of $100,000 district-wide in utility and transportation expenses, and that's a big if the schools have no requirements for being open on the 5th day. We know that particularly where there are activities or practicing for plays or any number of things, the schools would be open on the 5th day, so that then would take away from the utility costs. Approximately 120 districts in 21 states are on a 4-day schedule. They are mostly small and rural communities, averaging a savings of 0.4 to 2% of the total annual budget. This is from NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislators. The Legislative Education Study Committee conducted a study in May of 2014. The result of that study showed minimal cost savings with no measurable impact on student outcomes. The length of the school year is 150 instructional days on a 4-day week, so it's 1,080 hours. It's the same as a 5-day week, so the school days increased by 90 minutes. So we would still have to pay, the teachers, counselors, principals, et cetera. There's no savings in that personnel because you're going 4 days a week. Advantages of the 4-day school week for districts researched from New Mexico is from 15 to 400 students. There's less travel time for rural students. New Mexico is a very sparsely populated state, and there are kids who are on the bus for 2 hours a day to get to school in some parts of our state. So it is helpful for them to not have that long drive 5 days a week. So they save on fuel, food, utilities, and salaries for some workers. Primarily, those workers are cafeteria workers and transportation or bus drivers. They have longer blocks of time for instruction. The 5th day can be used for professional development, tutoring, and planning, but then you lose the utility savings. Makeup days could be used on the 5th day, but then again, if you're not saving on the utilities, that doesn't help. They do see lower absenteeism. They need fewer subs, so you get savings there, and less need for after-school childcare. And typically, what many rural communities do, particularly in New Mexico, that have to drive far to go in and buy food, go to doctors and dentist appointments, they tend to batch those appointments on Friday, which is why this is attractive to rural communities. The disadvantages for the Santa Fe Public Schools is that we believe most schools remain open on the 5th. It would remain open for either school-related or community city-sponsored events, which would then reduce the utility savings. Transportation miles are reimbursable. That's how we're funded for transportation. And reducing miles reduces revenue. But the negative impact truly is on our employees. If you recall last year when I first got here, we had to offer an incentive to be able to attract bus drivers because of the low pay. This would cut their pay by 20%. And they're some of our lowest paid and hardest to recruit employees. Food services costs are also reimbursable per meal. So therefore there would be zero savings there, but the impact would be for our employees who, again, are lowest paid. They would be seeing a 20% reduction in pay. The disadvantages, collective bargaining would be required if we were going to have teachers working a longer day, and also the 20% less compensation for bus drivers and student nutrition workers. We are concerned about childcare and supervision of students on the 5th day. The length of day for younger students from 7 hours to 8.5 hours a day we think would impact them. Low-income students would not get meals for 3 days in a row. We often send backpacks with food for kids on the weekends. Impact on extracurricular activities. So if you think of a longer school day and practices, it just makes for an exceedingly long and difficult day for kids. And then courses like mathematics, music, and foreign language really require daily practice, and particularly at these younger grades. So that would be an impact. So best case scenario is $100,000, or if the schools are open, then we really don't see any real savings on the 4-day school week. The next one that we looked at is reduction in central services. And, you know, I felt like since the schools, I mean, I have to give your former superintendent and you a lot of credit. You have cut back administration significantly. We'll look in a little bit. I think we have the slide, or maybe we don't, that we are below the state average there it is, for administrative expenses. However, yes, that's 4.5%. Our hours in the state is 5.43%. We look at cutting back and in the reorganization, $250,000. We intend to cut back on some positions, and in the reorg also reduce some salaries. We have some changes in personnel, so we'll be reducing some administrative salaries. I am very committed to administrative efficiency, and we will continue to look at that. In some places, it is more cost-effective to add some additional duties for a stipend than hiring a full FTE. So we're looking at where there can be additional teamwork and saving some money there. But again, we're stretched pretty thin. If we go to special education, this reduction is not so much that we're slashing special ed, but as you know, we're on prior year funding, which we, through state law, we're able to plan. We have a reduction in students that are high needs students that are graduating, so this will result in about $450,000 in savings. And then we're leveraging funding sources and community partners to continue the expansion of quality pre-K services that impacts the 3- and 4-year-old program. Other cost-saving measures, again, these would need to be negotiated in the collective bargaining process. If there were a reduction in stipends, it would be $1.2 million. Reduction in teacher prep time, we have not looked at that at all to cost it out, but if that were something you would want us to look at in lieu of other cuts, that would need to be negotiated. Increase in class size, it's our intent to remain with statutory requirements with waivers as necessary based on reasonable and sensible teacher assignments, but we would again need to be in compliance with the collective bargaining agreement. We have not cost this out because we think it does impact teaching and learning, particularly we're a high poverty school district, and research shows that class size does matter for students of high poverty. So we would be looking at, we have not cost that out, but if that was something you wanted us to look at, we will. Other cost-saving measures that are related to the collective bargaining, we don't have any, RIF plan, reduction in force. However, again, this would have to be dealt with with program consolidations, school closures, or as you saw in the school cuts to the schools. Depending on the level of cut to the schools, many of these could be absorbed through natural attrition. We have quite a few long-term subs, so that we hope we would not actually, people would lose jobs. If you should recommend furloughs as a gap, as we look at the different options, a cost of a furlough day for school-based staff, because there's more of them than administration, would be $340,000 a day. For central office staff, because there's less of us, that would be $40,000 a day. So what we need to look at is that there are minimum salaries in statute for teachers and principals, and therefore it is doubtful, what we've been told by the state, that there's no change in those statutory minimum salaries. Carl, you want to go to the next one? On 56? Just go ahead.
Thank you, Superintendent. The last couple other cost-saving measures that we've noted is the health insurance premium increase for staff. And then although anything that happens with staff is subject to collective bargaining, we've done this the last several years, and there's certainly a commitment all around from the board, from the staff, from NEA and SFPS to continue this process. And the cost of that is about $120,000 for projected for next year, and the accumulated amount, which is in the budget, is about $400,000. So, the really cost of continuing this, adding a year and continuing it, is about $520,000. The reduction in salaries piece, there are no plans to do that for an across-the-board reduction in salaries. Because of this limitation that we learned recently on furloughs, that you can't go below the minimum teacher salaries or principal salaries, we really question whether furlough days, or many of them, would be a reasonable option. There's certainly no plans for reduction in salaries, but in a worst case, this is probably where we need to take a look.
So in summary, the options that we've presented to you, and again, the options could be infinite depending on how you want to slice and dice it, but we really tried to look at your priorities, your direction based on the survey. And then fair student funding formula, given that we were looking at a potential draconian cut of 5%, which would have been $9 million to the district. So cuts to schools that you heard from our principals, and you saw that, would be $3.1 million. Consolidating the alternative high school programs is $450,000. We didn't recommend anything for athletics. Principal contract rollbacks is $100,000. School closures is $1.52 million. 4-day school week, it says 0. You could go up to $100,000 there if, in fact, we were not open on the 5th day, but we don't think that really is realistic. Reductions in central services is $700,000, and that comes up to a total menu of options right now at $5.87 million. So we have options to look at. And so we want to go back to the slide that you saw. And again, it depends on your comfort level. If you decide that, and you give us direction as we move forward, that you are comfortable with where the unit value was set and the budget that we've been given by PED, then you would only need to reduce the budget by $1.78 million. If you feel that you're not, you're uncomfortable with the uncertainty at the state level and you think that a 1% cut would be prudent, then we're looking at a reduction of $4.54 million. And as we said earlier, as some school districts are looking at, you're more concerned and you think you need a 2% buffer, that the state might come back and cut 2%, then we have to cut $5.51 million. As I said earlier, you can cut this in different ways. You could decide $1.78 million is static. Unless there's an increase in funding, that's what we have, that's the budget, that's set by the unit value. That number is not going to change unless there is an increase in revenue. The other two scenarios are based on a projection that nobody really knows for sure what's going to happen in Santa Fe prospectively. And we could build a budget based on the $1.78 million cut, and if there were more cuts coming, then we would have to cut the budget after the fact and do an amendment. Conversely, if you go with the 1% cut and we have to cut $4.54 million and more revenue appeared, then you could add program back. And I'm going quickly because I want to go over the options with you now. So the first option, number 1, is the $1.78 million. And, there's different ways. You could go back to your menu of options, but this is what we recommended in option 1. If we go with the $1.78 million, is the reduction in central office staff is $700,000. Consolidating the alternative school programs is $450,000. The fair student funding cut, reduce that to $630,000. We would be able to restore $2.57 million to the schools. We believe that $630,000 probably could be attributable to the lower enrollment. There is no recommendation here to have to cut schools, close schools. That would be a separate capital outlay decision that you could make later with more study, and most of this cut would be around declining enrollment. Chief Operations Officer, do you want to add anything to this scenario? Chief Financial Officer.
No, I think you covered it great.
Okay, so that's option 1.
Here's the story.
And the story behind it, I think, is pretty clear, that we're setting the unit, we're going by the unit value that was set by PED. that this would require for all of us to have confidence in what the legislature has said. There have been recent articles that have come out where both Republicans and Democrats have said they don't have an appetite for cutting public ed. The governor has said that she is committed to no more cuts. The risk we take is that there's a $156 million deficit, and depending on what happens with the Supreme Court, or if there's a special session, you've got a $156 million cut. Would public ed be spared? People are signaling that we probably would, but we don't know for sure. So that's the risk you're taking in scenario one with the $1.78 million. It has no school closures, and it restores most of the funding back to the schools. Option two is tougher. It's a 1%, adds the additional 1%. And additional 1%, the way it all falls out for us, is $4.54 million. There are two options. There's an option A and an option B. And option A has the school closures in it at $1.52 million. It has everything from before, but it restores $1.33 million to the schools and cuts the schools with the Fair Student Funding Formula at $1.77 million. The story behind that is that, you know, you're concerned about the unit value, and this, if in fact the current unit value held, you would be able to partially restore cash balance and put, as I said, 1.3 million back to the schools. Option 2B is the same dollar amount, but it doesn't have school closure. Option 2B is the same cuts as you saw before, but it takes the full 3.1 million from the schools and other measures, which we would have to define. Is that a furlough? It could be any number of things, right, Carl, to fill in that gap that you would pick, you know, for various options. So that's option 2 with the 1%. And I think I pretty much explained it. I think the same holds true here. Option 3 is the most draconian. Option 3 is what a lot of school districts are leaning towards. Some are, at least the largers, with a 2% cut. Option 3 has the $5.5 million cut. You would either go with option 2A or B, either, you know, cutting the schools or closing schools on 2A. But then we would have to add on top of that 2.5 to 3 furlough days, which would be almost $1 million for 5.51 million. And the story here obviously is, you know, if they're called back to a special session, the unit value doesn't hold, and they wind up cutting schools, cutting funding to schools, that would be your worst case scenario. So, Carl, do you want to just talk to them about choosing an option?
Sure. Thank you, Superintendent. This is a revisited slide from the first one, which was more consolidated. But the 3 bullets are a bit expanded here. The expenditure reduction reflects the assessment of risk. You know, we have to understand if, or you have to ask the question, even though there's not a desire to cut public education, can the governor and legislature come together on a resolution of that $156 million or not? So that's really the assessment there in this first bullet, along with the internal district priorities of, you know, what are the best combination of options to provide the necessary reductions. And the second one is a recognition that people look at this very differently. There's different filters, different lenses, and those are just the ones that seem the most obvious. You know, financial and political, students and teaching and learning, employees and bargaining units, families and community. We've heard assessments through all those filters, particularly recently in all the conversations. And the last one is just a reflection of a hope, I guess. We certainly hoped that the state would have resolved the budget by now. This is the first year in our experience where that has not been the case, which introduces this uncertainty. But as the superintendent mentioned, there's a long time between now and May 16th when the board is scheduled to vote on this budget, the whole district operating budget, on what could take place to perhaps shore up some confidence in what is most likely to take place.
So, as you can see, you have a calendar of events between May 2nd and when we have to submit the budget to the PED on May 31st. So May 2nd, you have talked about voting on operational budget balancing options, and also your decision, right, is inherent in there regarding closing schools. It's very important for us to have a sense of your target. And I think, maybe by May 2nd, again, as I talked about the analogy of a minute and a half left in a basketball game, a lot can happen. So numbers could change. We might not know more if that unit value is going to hold, that there won't be any decreases or maybe an increase. May 8th, Board, Staff, and Community, we have the final Finance Subcommittee. And we talked about this at a staff level, that depending on how May 2nd goes, you may not need the May 8th study session. I mean, that is possible. May 16th is really the date to vote on a district operating budget. Depending on what happens on May 2nd, or if there is a May 8th meeting, we have to leave a little bit of time if there are items that have to be negotiated, so that we can come back with confidence to tell you that, yes, this is what we could go with. If you go to the next slide. So, again, to repeat, what we've heard, we did our best to, again, listen with hearts and mind as we approach this, to do our due diligence and doing the best research that we could on fiscal impacts with unknown scenarios and try to guess. But again, it's a best guess. I couldn't tell you, if you were to say, if you're a betting person, which one would you pick? It would be a guess. I don't know for sure. But I could tell you what I would be leaning towards. But, I mean, I can't give, there's many things that I can advise you on that I feel very confident. This is not one of those times that I can say, yes, I can tell you with confidence that if you choose this, none of the other options will follow. Rather, I can give you recommendations and say, this is the risk that you take with each one of them. And if you ask me if I was on the board, what risk I'd be willing to take, well then, but again, it's just a guess. It's not a real, that I'm very confident. I'm not confident on any of it. But what you are trying to determine is the impact, right? Weighing that impact of financial risk versus the impact to our communities, to our school, all of our schools. So if you look at the brown, and this is our poor man's infographic because we don't have the software, but okay, and maybe someday we'll have good infographic software. But if you look on the brown bar going up is kind of an indication of risk. So option one, 1.78 million, little higher risk because we don't know if we're going to have to take another hit or not. But it impacts the fewer amount of community and students and staff. Option 2A and 2B, and Carl has to help me because I always forget which one has school closure and which one doesn't. 2A has school closure.
Right there.
Okay, and so there's the risk there. It's 4.54 million. That's 1%. That's betting that there would be a 1% cut, in an extraordinary or special session. The signaling from the policymakers is that there wouldn't be, but you never know. Scenarios change. Option 2B is the same dollar amount, same amount of risk, but it impacts all of the schools because you're talking about that 3.1 million. And then option 3 is the most conservative, lowest risk, and that is with a 2% scenario that many school districts are looking at with a 5.51. That hits everybody, that school closure and the 3 and a portion of employees and it, you've already seen it. So at this point in time, we can either stand for questions, I know, or do the break or do the comments, whatever your pleasure.
I'd like us to take a 15-minute break so that we can clear our heads and come back and take board questions to the cabinet and then do the public forum.
Hmm.